Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. My name is Rory, and you're watching Varietal Literature's YouTube channel, which is a channel where basically I just going to adjust the volume a bit, where we have some fun with narrative. And what we're doing here is we're reading old folklore and fairy tales, specifically some Icelandic folklore and some German folklore. Tonight, German folklore rather recently translated the Icelandic from Jan Arneson's rather classic book. I'm going to turn the volume down just slightly on the music. And if you've never been here before, this is the season of Hallowstreams. So the stuff here is a little more intense than normal, though folklore can always be pretty intense and weird. And is definitely... comes with some content warnings that I'll get to as I get there. As far as the people in the chat, so if you're watching live, you can join us in the live chat over to whatever side it is for you. I am glad to see GS, Tammy Morelli, Zombie Wolf, Lizzie Rose, and Genera here quite early tonight. I don't see Jumpstore yet. Oh, yes, I do. Never mind. Jumpstore says, are you sick already, Rory? The weather just started getting colder. I am not sick. Despite how this year has been, I normally don't get sick very much. I'm just a little congested because I ate some cheese. If you're not watching this live, down in the description below, there will be timestamps that'll jump you ahead to the stories we're reading tonight, of which there are several, because they are shorter snippets of folklore. Real folklore. Not just fairy tales. These aren't fairy tales. Tonight really isn't fairy tales. We do sometimes read fairy tales, but folklore, collected urban legends, things like that. So some of them are quite short. Some of them are collections of, real accounts that people have given. The accuracy of which you can question, but the accounts themselves were collected from real people who believed it. So on and so forth. Generis has got the day off, so I'm here all night. Woot woot. Yes. All right. Well, I'll try to make it a good one for your day off then. This, as a general overview of this, my general warning, the title of this stream is Killer Undead, which is probably enough to bury me in the algorithm, anything to do with killing or murder or anything in the speech of the video or on the title or in the thumbnail is enough to get you buried, but whatever. The Killer Undead means these are stories of death and murder. Some of it is on a fairly gruesome side of things. Some of it is okay, but judge accordingly. This is not necessarily a stream for kids. I don't think it is overall, but in particular, the Hallowstreams don't really target to a younger crowd. Zombie Wolf says, well, now you have my attention, Rory. What kind of cheese? This was boring, old, like aged cheddar. Nothing too special. But I do have an obsession with cheese. So let me talk a bit about tonight, because we do have actually, I think, about 8 or 9 stories to get through. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the concept of the undead in folklore, specifically where we're looking at it, Germany and Europe in general and Iceland. And then we'll get right to our stories. So, as we discussed last year during our Hallowstreams, until about the 19th and especially 20th century, vampires and zombies were essentially the same thing. In most European folklore. There are exceptions here and there. Little bits around that were maybe hinted at more. Now, the analogy of them being a blood-sucking lord, a royal of sorts, feasting on, their peers or even just random peasants and so on, comes arguably, of course, really in the form of the short story, The Vampire or The Vampyr, from John William Polidori during that famous, if you don't know it, famous storm at Lord Byron's house, where he made a bet about writing a scary story, and from that bet came Vampyr by Polidori, but also came Frankenstein from Mary Shelley. Then that sort of tradition, that idea of the vampire as a blood-sucking lord that, you know, was a part of the aristocracy, is carried forth with Sheridan Le Fanu in Carmilla, which we read last year. The whole thing live on stream in one go is like 4.5 hours. And a lot of us had a lot of fun with that. That's still on the channel if you want to go see Carmilla. And of course, it is most famously cemented a few decades later with Bram Stoker's Dracula, from which we draw most of our modern conceptions of vampires. Don't think I'm telling you anything you don't know. But long before that literary lineage, which covers around a century, was established, vampires were often a sort of vengeful undead that crawled from the grave to kill any number of folks for any number of reasons. And in the German traditions we were reading last year, of which again is still on the channel, and if you want to find them, there is a whole Hallowstream playlist for all the Fireside Fairytales that were read during October. Vampires often killed their family members in the weeks after they were buried, the weeks and months after they were buried. In these stories tonight, which covered German and Icelandic, the reasons are more varied, from like desecration to just honest mistakes to just sort of menace and evil. But nonetheless, all of them tell a tale of strange vengeance from the undead. So whether, with all of that said, a lot of the time when we're reading here, the terms undead, I don't think zombie comes up specifically, but you could slot in zombie for some of this, and vampires, and even to some extent sort of ghosts and spirits, sometimes gets used pretty interchangeably. That divide of like what a vampire is and what a zombie is and how you deal with a vampire and how you deal with a zombie and all of that kind of stuff, that comes later as a part of a literary tradition and less of a folklore tradition, although it, you know, the literary tradition is pulling from some pieces of folklore. Nonetheless, that's what we're talking about tonight. We're talking about when the dead comes back and kills people in sometimes gruesome ways. These are several tales of the killer undead in folklore, specifically German and Icelandic. Jumpstore says, what do you mean, Rory? Everyone knows vampires are pale, brooding emo kids who sparkle in the sunlight like they just left the Pride Parade. I mean, I think it's a good example of like vampires. There is this like this tendency in modern discourse around this kind of stuff, whatever it is, to like want to define and keep that definition in place. Like, I remember when Twilight is what you're referencing came out, and there was a lot of like, that's so stupid. But like, you know, I didn't love that rendition of vampires, but also I can't really say that the rendition of vampires that people were calling like proper was particularly old either. Like, Bram Stoker's Dracula is just over a century old, and that's where a lot of these ideas came from. And if you reach back another century, none of these ideas are there, and they just look like zombies, which is what we'll show tonight. All right. It's enough of me babbling. Let's put some mood on. Also, let me know if the volume is too hot on the sound effects. It was a little bit the other day. Yeah, it wasn't my cup of tea, Lizzie, but I understand its appeal. I don't really... I think if anything, it probably got a bit too much hate just because it got really popular. And so people who it really wasn't made for felt like they had to watch it, and that was a mistake. It's pretty clear about who it's for. All right. Oh, and just for Jum's story, here's a little girl saying something. What? I don't know. I think that's the one it said last time. Okay. That's enough screwing around. Remember, there is timestamps down below if you want to skip all this. Our first story tonight is called Of Murderous Dead People. Very direct. And it comes to us from the collection Sunken Castles, Evil Poodles. And of course, that is translated by Jürgen Hubert, who you can support on his Patreon at Sunken Castles, Evil Poodles, where he translates previously untranslated German folklore into English. Doing great work over there, and it's very cheap to support, and you should, because I depend on it, and you get great stories every month. This is a collection of little tales of when the dead crawled out of their grave and killed someone. In the year 1617, in Eibenschutz, Moravia, that an honorable citizen who had been buried in the churchyard always rose up in the night from his grave and murdered people. Each time he did so, he pulled off his funeral gown. This funeral gown thing is going to come up a lot, FYI. If you need an example of it, you can certainly Google it. And he put it on again once he returned. When the guards on the tower once saw this, they took his gown away, and when he returned to the grave and did not find his gown, he shouted at the guards that they should give him his clothes, or else he would strangle them. Upon hearing this, they returned it, of course, but soon after that man was dug up, cut into pieces, and then his wanderings stopped. And when he was taken out of the grave, he spoke that they had done the right thing. If they had laid his wife next to him once she was dead, then both of them would have murdered half the city. The executioner pulled a long veil torn by bite marks out of his mouth, which he had ripped off his wife's head. I think one of the things I like about each of these little snippets is they just give you accounts of weird things with no real explanation. In the year 1567, one Stefan Hübner, an inhabitant of Trottenau in Bohemia, lived in such great fortune that he had splendid buildings erected for himself and was merely called the rich Hübner by everybody. Finally, he died and was buried in splendor. Soon after, he was seen on the surface out of his grave. He embraced many people sweetly, wrapping his arms around them and then squeezing them so hard that some of them died or fell ill from this. It was then that the courts ruled that the dead man was an infernal entity, and the executioner was ordered to dig the corpse up from the ground. This was done, and he was brought beneath the gallows, and his head was cut off, and then the blood poured out of the head and out of the chest as well, even though he had spent more than 5 months in the grave. He was burned, and many people were witness to this. In the year 1557, a herder was buried about a mile distant from the city of Ketill in Bohemia. This herder rose up every night, went into the villages, and terrified the locals, talked with humans as if he was still alive, and murdered several people. Those whom he mentioned by names died after a few days, and it was the neighbors who hammered a stake through his body and said, "You believe," but he only laughed about this and said, "You believe you can kill me with this? But you only provide me with a stick, which will allow me to better defend myself." And when he was finally buried by two executioners, he pulled his legs towards him and emitted an animalistic groaning. And when his side was pierced, the blood flowed out of it, and he did not return after this. In the year 1545, the wife of a potter in the Bohemian town of Leven suddenly died. She was then buried at a crossroads, and afterwards she appeared to many in the shape of wild animals and killed several people. When she was unearthed, she had the veil in her throat, which had been tied around her head, and it was full of blood. An oaken stake was hammered into her chest, but she pulled it out and killed several more people with it. Finally, her body was burned together with the stake, and the ashes were put in the grave. Then everything stopped, but at the site where the woman was burned, a whirlwind was seen for many subsequent days. GS says no music tonight. There's music. Can you not hear it? I can turn it up a bit. Jumpstore says this story is reminding me of the scary stories to Tell in the Dark collection. Oh yeah. I swear the story would blend right into that book. I believe it. So we start tonight. Jeez, was a mistake. Turning the music up a bit. It shouldn't be any different than it was. Maybe just quieter music. It is definitely quieter music, that's true. All right. The next one, I think, is one of the more disturbing images I've found in my years of reading folklore. It's not anything too specific about it. That's weird. It's very loud for me. I'm so hesitant to turn it up more because I'm a little concerned that we're going to, I'm going to find out later that it was something about your guys' mix, and the actual YouTube video will be off again. But hopefully that'll do. Okay, so the next one is among the more disturbing images to me personally. It's not the most disturbing one tonight, I don't think, but it's up there. But you might not have the same kind of imagination as me, and in which case I think it's probably going to wash right over you. Gia says, you don't trust us after last time. I mean, no one's obligated to do anything production-wise with my stream. But yeah, I mean, I was a little disappointed when I found out that my voice was getting so buried. Hopefully that's not happening this time. The levels seem to be saying it's not. Okay. I appreciate the feedback about the sound, though. If I make the sound any louder in my ears, I don't know if I'm going to be able to hear myself. So we'll have to set it that way for now. Our next tale is called The Smacking Death, for reasons that do not become clear. I don't know why it's called that. But it's definitely a content warning. This also comes from Sunken Castle's Evil Poodles, a collection of translated German folklore from Jürgen Hubert. In the year 1565, it occurred in Zongerhausen that a distinguished matron died. After her departure, a great dying began that was so rapid that the number of dead people increased from week to week. First, the number of dead increased from 18 people to 30, then to 50, then to 60, 80, and finally 129. Then a rumor arose among the locals that this must be the Smacking Death, which arose from the above-mentioned matron. She would feast in her grave and gorge herself on any nearby, and people had heard of a number of similar examples elsewhere, and as long as such smacking endured, the dying would spread further. For this reason, many demanded that the grave should be opened, that the veil and funerary clothes should be ripped away from the dead one, and that a grave spade should be used to cut off her head, as such method had been used to good account elsewhere. Such demands could only be staved off with good effort, and it was next to impossible to get the people to abandon their superstitions. In 26 weeks, 1,174 people died, consumed by Zongerhausen, which had only 700 houses at the time. Now, I know what you're thinking. That's not too disturbing, Rory. But I want you to, see it the way I see it. This old, rotting dead woman, absolutely bloated out of her grave, stuffing the wriggling bodies of people into her mouth. Honestly, a great monster. Genera says death is rude like that. My best guess is that smacking here refers to the sound of her chewing people, but maybe it's something else. There might be a note in the translation here that I haven't read. I try not to steal Jürgen's notes, so I try not to read too many of them before I've read them on stream, because sometimes ideas come back to you as your own. You discover that they're not. All right. Gennaro says, so a zombie. Again, zombie and vampire are practically interchangeable at this in folklore, up to a point. Now this one has a really cool title. It's okay. It's more an interesting concept than it is a specifically haunting tale. Again, we're moving through some simple ones, but I will say after this one is the most disgusting origin for vampires I've ever heard. So stick around because well, you'll see. But this story first. Our next story is called The One Who Dies First, the Plague of the Plague Devours the Others. It also comes to us from Jürgen Hubert's collection. Again, you can support him on his Patreon. In the year 1564, there was a great dying in the land, and a lot of people passed away in 2 villages belonging to the Lubanist district of Kunosberg. At this time, 3 farmers came to the priest Hennenberger, who administered this area, and asked for a burial at a site determined by them. He agreed to the burial, but he dismissed their request for a specific site, for the school teacher had complained to him that they were burying so many dead people in front of his back door, so that he was unable to get to the churchyard to ring the bells, even though they had enough space elsewhere. Well, then they told the priest the reason for this request, for it had been reported to them that the first person who had died in a village during a time of the plague would sit up in their grave. They would consume their funeral cloth, and as long as they were able to continue eating it, the dying would not cease in the village. And this had occurred at certain named villages, and they had found the indicated people sitting up in their graves and feasting upon their own cloth. Then the locals had cut off the dead person's head with a spade, and the dying ended. But Hennenberger told them that the plague was a punishment by God for their sins, and admonished them to bury their dead people at another spot of the churchyard. And the Lord God made that this was the last person in the village who died of this illness. In another village, the first person who died had been buried on a field, for he had never visited God's table. A large group of people had secretly dug him up, and they had found him sitting and eating the funeral cloth. They then cut his neck so that his blood sprayed over the diggers, but since they had been fooled by the devil himself, they could see no other approach than this. But they suffered for this, for everywhere they found sick people in their houses, and many more people died than before. For in this hamlet there were only 6 farmers and numerous gardeners, and yet 49 people died of this, not counting the one whom they'd buried on the field. A magister named Georges Roveris had written a similar historical anecdote to Dr. Martin Luther King at Wittenberg. A woman had died in his village, and then after she had died, she sat up in her grave, and for this reason all people in the village had died as well. Now, this one is, I think, historically interesting, having lived through a plague now and seen how superstitions emerge. But I do offer you a disturbing thought that I won't clarify. I don't believe that people were setting up and cursing the village. You know, we're talking about communicable diseases, so the first one to die would probably have spread it, right? It makes sense. The question you need to ask yourself is why, when they dug them up, were they eating their clothes if they were dead? Superstitions aside, that's a disturbing enough thought. Now we get to one of the most specifically odd and disgusting versions of a vampire tale I've ever seen. You want to talk to me about traditional vampire origins and lore? I've never heard anybody reference this one, and I would love to see this one come up in some film or something. But first, a little bit of tea. Are we drinking tea tonight, or something else? And if we are, what are we drinking? Zero says eating your shroud is a common thing with folklore, zombies, and vampires. Yes, it is. But I don't know why or where it comes from. I think it's because they dug some people up and found it that way, which says something about the state of them when they were buried. Genera says, I got some mint mystique green tea. Ooh, yummy. Our next story and our last German tale before we switch over to our Icelandic tales is called The Vampyr in the Wendland region. Again, remember, at this time, vampire and zombie were pretty much an interchangeable concept. It also comes to us from Sunken Castle's Evil Poodles, translated by Jürgen Hubert, who you should support by clicking the link in the pinned comment below. People in the entire Wendland region believe in vampires, and it is said that they arise in the following manner. If a child is weaned off the mother's breast, but then receives the breast again after the first 24 hours have passed, for those do not count, then they will eventually become a vampire once they have died. This isn't the gross part. But deceased children will not become vampires, only children who have been weaned off twice and then reached a stout age. For this reason, vampires are also called Dobazuka, are double sucker, and the mothers are very careful not to raise a young vampire at the bosom of their family by weaning their children off twice. But if such a person has died, then they maintain a kind of half-life in the grave. In particular, their head and their mouth can move and emit sounds, and this is my last content warning. It gets kind of gross and weird from this point on. However, they do not go out of their grave and suck their relatives. There's a sentence you didn't expect to hear today. Instead, using their living mouth, they start to suck on their own breast. And when they have sucked up the skin and the fleshy parts, then this will affect their king through a sympathetic connection. Thus all their life force will be sucked out of them, and they will become pale, scrawny, weak, and must follow the double sucker into the grave before a year has passed. The double sucker will now continue to suck out the second person in the family until they have fetched all them to themselves. And finally, if they are not stopped, the entire family will die out. However, they will not touch anyone who isn't their closest kin, which means their brothers, sisters, and their own children in particular. And someone who has been killed by a double sucker will not become a vampire themselves unless they are a natural double sucker by having been weaned off twice, although this is hard to say for sure with any one person. Tools against the deadly influence of these double suckers are the first, the wooden board. And then the krigstaya, drya, corn, and finally the passage beneath the threshold. For the relatives arrange for a board to be cut such a size that it covers the chest and extends beneath the chin, and affix it on the chest of the dead person so that it becomes impossible for them to suck on their own chest. Silver Krutzviten with the gold coin with the globe and plate cross on it is put into the mouth of the dead person as the embossment of the cross and the coin, which can thus be considered holy, prevents the activities of the sucking mouth. But these coins have become very rare, and when a family owns one, they will be carefully stored for such emergencies. Finally, the passage beneath the threshold is likely a reference that spirits and ghosts must leave a building through the same spot where they entered it. Thus, if they were carried out of the house beneath the threshold, they cannot return above the threshold, a very common sort of thing in folklore that. But the main entrance doors of the farmhouses in the Wendland have a plank as their threshold, which is movable and merely fitted into place. It is taken out when the grain wagon from the harvest arrive and the grain is taken to the attic. Thus, if it is suspected that a deceased person has been weaned off twice, then two people step towards the threshold, lift as high as they can, and the coffin and the entire funeral procession has to travel out of the entrance corridor beneath the threshold. Oh, we're talking about, yes, the point is that Jumpstore says raspberry leaf, I'm assuming for tea, is good for more than just cramp. For me, it shortens the time I spend bleeding, I'm assuming with a period. Otherwise, something else has happened. I say for me because everyone's different, can't guarantee that it will do it for you. Yeah, Giasa gets it. He's hinting they were buried alive. Yeah. So, it wasn't terribly uncommon to get buried alive back then. Like, we do a lot of things now to make sure that doesn't happen, but it definitely happened. And, I mean, what exactly motivates a person to cram their own funeral gown into their mouth to the point that drawing it out they find blood? I don't know. Could be the panic of suffocation. Could be the pain of it and how slow it is. Maybe they're trying to choke themselves out quicker. Maybe it's just sort of a mad frenzy. But have you ever heard of a theory of origin for vampires, where the vampire doesn't crawl out of the grave, but rather sucks its own skin off and all the fleshy bits via milking its own nipple in the grave? It's the little things that stick with me in these stories. Alright, let's look at some Icelandic lore. Another few short stories about vengeful dead. Zero says the blood might just be from decomp, maybe. It could be, but they say that it's crammed down their throat in a lot of them. Like, that's not accidental. Like, the superstition of it, sure, it's kind of creepy and cool and whatever, but if you think through what it's trying to explain, the phenomenon they're finding when it explains, honestly, that's the more disturbing part. Now, the Icelandic ones, unlike the ones we've just been reading, where it tends to be you didn't follow a certain ritual, and so now the dead are after you, or whatever else. These ones are more about you did something, whatever it was, to desecrate or disturb the dead, and they are vicious in response. Now, this is my usual disclaimer that I am terrible at pronouncing Icelandic, despite my best efforts. When I hear it, there's sounds in there I just can barely pick out, and I certainly can't duplicate in my mouth. So I do my best, but I do apologize. And of course, if you are Icelandic, you probably already know these tales because they come from Jon Arnarsson's book, and that's the iconic Icelandic one. Maybe you'll just be annoyed listening to me, and these won't be for you. I don't know. According to Google Translate, Ketill, or Ketill, is just like a kettle. But Google Translate's not very trustworthy. Our next tale comes from Icelandic Legends, a collection by Jon Arnarson from the 19th century, kind of the iconic Icelandic English language collection. Well, actually, I think it was originally in Icelandic. This is the English version, obviously. And the first story we're reading from it, carrying with our theme of undead who kill the living. Kirin, the priest of Husavik. Because there once lived a priest at Husavik, whose name was Kirin. Finding the churchyard rather crowded, he dug up a good many of the coffins, saying that they were no use where they were, but only took up room, and used them for firewood. Now, some time after, in a kitchen nearby, 3 old women were sitting round a fire where some of the coffin planks were burning, and a spark flew out, set fire to the dress of one of them, and as they were sitting close together, the flame quickly caught the dresses of the other 2 and burnt so fiercely that all 3 were dead before anyone could come to their assistance. Now, the next night, the priest saw a man come to his bedside, who said, "Do not endeavor to make room in the churchyard by taking out our coffins and burning them. You see that I have already killed 3 old women, and if you go on this way, I will kill many more and fill up your graves for you quicker than you will like." The priest took the warning, burnt no more coffins, and saw no more ghosts, nor were any more old women killed. Our next story also comes from Jon Arnarsson's collection, Icelandic Legends, and it is called Whitecap. And it's a very simple and straightforward and frankly horrible story about somebody getting something they do not deserve. A certain boy and girl, whose name this tale telleth not, once lived near a church. The boy, being mischievously inclined, was in the habit of trying to frighten the girl in a variety of ways, till she became at last so accustomed to his tricks that she ceased to care for anything whatever, putting down everything strange that she saw and heard to the boy's mischief. One washing day, the girl was sent by her mother to fetch home the linen, which had been spread to dry in the churchyard. I'd be curious on the history of that, if that's common to put laundry in someone else's yard. When she had nearly filled her basket, she happened to look up and saw sitting on a tomb near her a figure dressed in white from head to foot, but was not the least alarmed, believing it to be the boy playing her, as usual, a trick. She ran up to it, pulled its cap off, and said, "You shall not frighten me this time." Then, when she had finished collecting the linen, she went home. But to her astonishment, for he could not have reached home before her without her seeing him, the boy was the first person who greeted her on her arrival at the cottage. Among the linen, too, when it was sorted, was found a moldy white cap, which appeared to be nobody's property, and which was half full of earth. Well, the next morning the ghost, for it was a ghost that the girl had seen, was found sitting with no cap upon its head, upon the same tombstone as the evening before, and as nobody had the courage to address it, or knew in the least how to get rid of it, they sent into the neighboring village for advice. An old man declared that the only way to avoid some general calamity was for the little girl to replace on the ghost's head the cap she had seized from it. And in the presence of many people, all of whom were to be perfectly silent, so a crowd collected in the churchyard, and the little girl, going forward, half afraid, with the cap, placed it upon the ghost's head, saying, "Are you satisfied now?" But the ghost raised its hand and gave a fearful blow and said, "Yes, but now are you satisfied?" And the little girl fell down dead. And at the same instant, the ghost sank into the grave upon which it had been sitting and was no more seen. Our second to last story, we have one more after this, also comes from Icelandic Legends by Jon Arnarson. And, moment here. There we go. This tale is called A Ghost's Vengeance, and it comes to us from Icelandic Legends, a collection by Jon Arnarson. Some years ago, two friends were conversing together on various subjects, and among others on corpses, as one does. "If I ever happen to find a dead man," said the one, "I shall do my best for it and bury it." "For my part," replied the other, "I shall take no such trouble, but pass it by like any other carrion." Now some time passed away, and one day Ketill, that was the name of the latter, was out walking and found the corpse of an old woman lying in the road, but passed by without paying the slightest attention to it. The next night, after he was in bed, the old woman appeared to him and said, "No thanks to you for your neglect of me, for you did me neither good nor evil." And she looked so horrible that he jumped out of bed and grasped a large knife that lay near him and chased the spectre from the house, cursing and swearing and crying, "Shall I stab you, you old witch?" After this, he went to bed again and fell asleep. And then he saw the woman a second time. This time she was holding her lungs. All clotted with blood in her hand, and making as if she was going to strike him with them. So he jumped out of bed with the knife, and before he could reach her, she had disappeared again. And when he got into bed again and was asleep, she came a third time, almost as if she would strangle him. So a third time he jumped out of bed with the knife, but failed in reaching her before she vanished. And this hag's ghost followed the now unhappy Ketill all his life, and drove him with her wrath and spite into an untimely grave. Whether Ketill's friend ever found a corpse and had a chance of carrying out his charitable intentions with regard to it, the story narrates not. Neither does it so much as hint at what reward he would have got for his pains. But we know the punishment, at least. A ghost trying to beat you to death with her own clotted, bloody lungs is a pretty metal image for a 19th century folklore book. Gonna give it credit there. Jumpstore says, back in the olden days when you could pass by a corpse without any obligation. Dang, those were the days. Yeah. That's a wild choice to make. She's dead, who cares? I'm just skipping over a story that we have actually read before to get to our last story. This is an odd story, and I put it at the end not because it's the scariest, but because it wasn't so clear how it fit the theme and whatever else. But it was odd, and I didn't quite know where else to put it. One of the things I'll say before I read this last story is something that stands out for me about all of these tales that are just sort of bits and collected, rumors that towns had passed on for centuries and embellished upon and whatever else, is they themselves don't really tend to make up what we would consider like cohesive, involved stories. But they're such good seeds for them. Like, if you want to write a ghost story, you got like 8 good starters here. I'm like 50-50 if I want the fat woman from the grave who eats people to be a short story I write. The next and last story of the night is called The Two Sigurdurs, and it also comes to us from Icelandic Legends by Jon Arnarsson. A farmer once had a son named Sigurdurs, or Sigurdur, I think it was what we would say in North America, who was so ill-tempered that no one could live in peace with him. One day it happened that a man whose name was also Sigurdurs came to the farmer's house, and asked shelter of him for the winter, which the farmer consented to give him. The stranger did nothing but play the flute, and the farmer's son became so fond of him that he cared for nobody else. In the spring, the stranger went away, and Sigurdurs became so sick of home life that he also left the farm and went in search of his beloved namesake. From house to house, from parish to parish, from district to district, he went, continually asking for Sigurdurs. At last, at a certain priest's house, where he made the same inquiry, they told him that a man of that name had just died there and lay in the church. On being admitted into the church, the boy sat down by the open coffin, intending to watch over it all night. But at midnight, the corpse of Sigurdurs, for it really was his friend, rose from the coffin and left the church. But his namesake sat still and awaited his turn, wide-eyed. At dawn, the corpse indeed came back, but Sigurdurs would not let him, in spite of his entreaties, return to his coffin before telling him how he'd spent his night outside the church. So the dead man said, "I have been looking over my money, and now I must get into the coffin." "No," replied the other. "You must first tell me where your mother is." "In one of the corners of the family room," said the other. "How much is there of it?" "1 barrelful." "Did you do nothing?" again inquired the youth, "besides counting your money?" And the corpse denied it, but when the living Sigurdurs pressed him to tell him how he'd been employed in the night, on pain of refusing to admit him into his coffin again, the other answered, "Well, then, I have killed the priest's lady, who has just had a child." "Why did you commit so mean a crime?" asked Sigurdurs. "Because," replied the corpse, "during her lifetime, I tried to seduce her, but she always resisted my persuasion." "How did you kill her?" The dead Sigurdurs answered, "I drove all the life in her body into her little finger." "Can she not be revived?" asked the youth. "Yes, if you can untie the thread that is round her finger without shedding any blood, she will come to life. And now, I really must get into my coffin." The other only allowed him to do so on his promising that he would not ever try to move again. And in the morning, as soon as the sun was fully risen, Sigurdurs left the church and entered the family room, where he found everyone plunged in grief. And on his asking them what was the matter, they told him that the priest's wife had died in the night and nobody could tell her complaint. So he asked permission to see her, which was granted him, and having gone up to the dead woman and undone the cord which he'd found round her little finger, he urged back the life from it into her body, and she sat up, alive and well. Then he told the priest about his interview with the corpse of Sigurdurs, and to prove his words still further, showed him the money hidden in the corner of the family room. The priest thanked him cordially for the good service he'd done him, and after that, Sigurdurs became as much beloved as he had before been hated. Gia says, I thought Double was a nice guy. It's a deeply confusing story. Yes, you are correct. The kid who's supposed to be the mean one goes out to find supposedly the nice one who did nothing but play the flute. Finds out that he's a weirdo who kills people from after death. It's a very strange story. I'm not sure what the overarching theme will be, but if you're interested in old folklore and fairy tales and stuff like that, one of the reasons you might be is because of the game or the books or the TV series, depending on whatever was your path into it, for The Witcher, which I have Geralt here. I don't know if you can see him. My intention is that next week we will read a series of stories that is the origin, pretty explicitly the origin, of the Noonwraith, which is the first thing you really have to deal with when you play The Witcher 3, the game. But also makes an appearance in the books. So, I think that's interesting, and maybe you will too. It's one of our only, daylight spirits our revenants, I guess we should call them, that we'll cover. As far as what else we'll be reading about, I haven't quite decided, but that's a thought for next week, Rory. Jump Story says, what? He turned the money in? Completely unrelatable protagonist. Yeah, I find that unusual even for folklore. That's okay, Jump Story. I think we all could use some money in our pocket. Zombie Wolf says, Wes Craven had the idea. This is their random trivia. Wes Craven had the idea to give Freddy Krueger his signature glove after his cat tore apart his couch. He was fascinated by the savagery and primal fear those claw marks induced. I have the savagery and primal fear of those claw marks in a continuous set of scratches on my legs. They heal, and he doesn't do it so much that it's all the time, but it's like he notices. He's like, oh, no, they're all healed now, so I got to make a new one. Genera says another reason to love cats. Well, that is our Murderous Undead episode done for the year. I'm sure I will have more yet. I'm sure I will have more yet next year, because it is one of the most common things you see in folklore around horror. But we'll at least talk about the Noonwraith next week, and maybe some other things. And also a reminder that we will get an extra Hallowstream this year in November. Once Jürgen has finished translating, we will be doing an episode, probably the grimmest episode I've ever put together, of stories that I just kind of want to all get them done at once, about cannibalism. Yeah, GS, I really don't know. The story is so strange. It's even hard. As far as if you want writing advice, don't name two people the same thing in a story. Especially when it never matters. It never really comes about in any significant way, other than they happen to share the name. Have fun at your workshop, Jump Store. I think we'll probably be designing nightmares, and on our stream Thursday where we play solo tabletop RPGs. I reserve the right to change that. It might be a shorter stream because I'm going to be a bit busy for a few days, and it kind of lands in the middle of it, so I don't know how much energy I'll have, but I'm sure we'll have fun nonetheless, designing some nightmare realms. I'll say more about that on Thursday, presuming I don't change my mind and play something else. Anyhow, I hope you folks enjoyed the ghost stories and the old folklore and the undead feasting on the living. And I'll keep the fire going for you. You try to have yourself a good sleep.